everyone, welcome back to Cottoverdi. Today I'm going to finish the process of putting my dahlias into storage for winter. Now I filmed a video about how we tag them and dig them and wash them down, and I'll link that video in the description below because it's kind of part one, so if you haven't seen that, do take a look either now or afterwards. But this particular part of the process is us having left them out to dry off, so they're properly dry now and we're not putting them into storage wet. And I'm going to show you how I store them here. So I live in South Buckinghamshire in the UK, and it is cold and damp all winter long. So how I store my dahlias here is how I have found it works best for us in this very damp environment. If you live in a very dry climate, then you probably don't want to do it this way. You possibly want to wrap them in saran wrap or cling film, but if you're in a damp environment, then it's important for us to keep them as dry as possible. Anyway, this is the process after many years of experimenting that I have found works best for me, and we store them in crates in our garage where it doesn't freeze, but it's also not warm, it's not heated, and we store them in, excuse me, and we store them in wood shavings, which is basically like pet bedding. So I'm going to show you the whole process in detail so you can take a look and maybe this will work for you. It is important to note that a lot of people store their dahlias very differently. People basically tend to experiment and find what works best for them, and a lot of people keep them in the ground, and I explain more about that in the previous video. So if you're wondering whether to dig them or not, you do need to look at the previous video that I will link in the description below. But this is what I do and it works for me, and I thought you might be interested in the process. So anyway, let's get cracking. I'm going to show you what I'm using. So this is what I've got out. So I've got crates of dahlias that I've been drying upside down for a week. I've got snips and secateurs and a sharp knife. This is the pet bedding that we use. It is just wood shavings, so you can use anything similar. It doesn't have to be a particular brand or anything, and I'll show you what it looks like close up so you can see what I'm using. And I just get it in big sacks. And then when we've finished and we unpack all the dahlias next year, if it hasn't got mouldy and your dahlias haven't gone mouldy or anything like that, which they shouldn't, you can reuse it. Or what I like to do is to use it on the compost as my brown layer. So what we do is when we put a lot of green stuff on the compost, we intersperse it with the stuff that we've taken out of the dahlia crates, so it goes into compost and it's not wasted. And actually I find we need a lot of brown stuff. And then these are the bags that we use. So I use net bags, and I'll show you more of this process as I do it, but we use net bags so we keep the tags with the dahlias, and then I don't have to write anything on my actual dahlia tubers. And then this is the crate over here that we use. Now these crates, you can use any crate, but these crates have ventilation, which is important. So they've got ventilation in the sides and the ends, but they have solid bottoms. So what I do is I just line it with packing paper, which, you know, we get in parcels throughout the year. So I save that, and I line it so that the sawdust doesn't start tumbling out and making a mess in my garage, and that's the only reason. So obviously a sheet of paper is very breathable, so it's not going to block any of the ventilation. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a layer of this lovely the wood shavings at the bottom of the crate, and then I'm going to start putting my dahlia tubers in, and I'll show you how I clean them up and what I do with them, and I'll give you options in case you want to do something different. So I'm not putting a thick layer in the bottom, I'm just putting a layer sort of as insulation, so just to keep them sort of snugly and help them bed in. It really isn't anything precise, it's about an inch maximum depth in there. Now these are the dahlia tubers that have dried. You can see that we rinsed them off last week and they're all lovely and dry now. and each one has got one of these plastic tags with a name on and also one of these tags. So I tend to do an individual process. So hang on a second, I'm going to move this crate so that we've got room on the table. And then what I'm going to do, because what we don't want is all of these stems taking up loads of room. So I'm going to cut all the stems down like this. Try not to cut my tag. Like that. Now the stems, we don't need the stems anymore. They can go in the bin. And then with dahlia tubers, you can just pack them like this into here with your labels. But what I've found in the years past is that over time, as I'm checking them through the winter, these labels get dislodged from the tubers, and then by the time I come to plant them next year, I can't tell that this is a wine-eyed Jill. So what you could do is you could take this plastic label if you wanted to, this bit of tape, and I explained more about this tape in the previous video, as I said before. If I can undo this. So you could take this and tie it round an actual tuber like this, and you could even slot that in there if you like, and just do it like this and plonk it in there. And it could just go in the sawdust like that, and then you could surround it with sawdust. But what I like to do is, first of all, I like to tidy up. So I just get my snips. So I like to tidy up, take off all these straggly bits. So these bits here on a tuber are not going to grow into an actual tuber. And so you don't need them. Now you do not have to do this process. And in fact, you could do it next year when you unpack them if you want. So you don't have to do it now, especially if it's cold and miserable. But another reason that I'm doing this now is because it gives me another chance to check for anything that's broken or damaged that perhaps I don't want to keep in storage, anything that I think might rot. So I'm just going to chop these bits off and just take a look at my tuber as I do it. Now what I'm noticing with this particular tuber is that this one here, this tuber here, has got a hole in it where it's been pierced, and it's also, can you see that it's a darker colour to the newer tubers? So this is like what we call a mother tuber, so it's possibly the one that was planted first. This one I'm going to chop off because it had a broken neck, so we don't need that. And I'm going to chop off this older tuber that's got a hole in it, because that hole is more likely to rot over the winter, and so I just don't want to introduce it into this environment where I'm trying to keep everything dry. Now that is as much as I'm going to do to this tuber, but if you wanted to, and in fact I will show you, you can actually divide this tuber now if you want to. So during this process you can choose to divide your tubers, your dahlia tubers, if you want to. I don't tend to do it at this time of year because I find it quite cold, and by dividing them and discarding them, I feel like I'm just reintroducing another option, another way that they could start rotting. And so if I cut them now, then they're going to have to dry out again before I put them into storage, because I really don't want it to be a damp environment, because our whole environment is damp at this time of year, in fact throughout the winter. So I want to keep them dry, but if you wanted to, you definitely can divide your tubers now, then leave them to dry off overnight and then put them into storage afterwards. And in all honesty, with the bigger clumps, it really does help to do it now, because that way they'll take up less space in storage, and it's why a lot of people do choose to do it at this time of year. I tend to find it's just too cold. I don't want to be doing something like this. I'd rather be doing it in the spring when it's warmer. I find that much more pleasurable than doing it right now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this clump just to show you what you could do if you want to divide it now. I have got other videos that go into loads of detail with many examples of how to divide dahlia tubers, and they're all on my channel on a playlist called Dahlias. And in fact, I'll link one or two of them in the description below just to make it easier for you to find them. But if you want to learn how to divide dahlias and you're interested in that, then do watch that. But I'm not going to spend too much time on it today because I think it's important just to get these all packed up and put away and tucked up nice and warm for the winter. So I'm going to take this spot here where there's like a natural gap, and I'm going to dig my knife in here and just break it apart. And if you wiggle a little bit, we can just separate it like that, and now I've got 2 clumps for next year. Now you could definitely go about separating this more. You could separate here. In fact, I could show you that too. So we can just go between here and just break it off. So the important thing that you've got to have if you're dividing your dahlia tubers is you need to have an actual tuber, the fat bit. It needs to have a neck. Now some necks are long, some don't exist at all, they're much shorter. And then it's just got to have part of the crown, because this area here, this sort of swollen area here, that is where the eyes are, and you need to have this bit in order for it to grow a dahlia next year. So let me show you on this example. So some necks are longer, some necks don't really exist, and they all need to have this sort of swollen bit here. This swollen bit is really important because that's where all the eyes are. So in fact, it's quite easy to see. These little bumps here, let me try and focus that. So these little bumps here, the tiny little raised bumps, those are the eyes that will create shoots next year. So whether you're dividing your dahlias or not, that's entirely up to you. What I do though, with all my dahlias, is I put them all into one of these bags. So if it's the same named dahlia variety, this is Wine-Eyed Jill, I put them all into this bag. And the most important thing is I put them in with one of these white tags. And then these have quite handily got a drawstring. And then what I'm going to do is put them into here, spread them out a little bit. And you can, you know, store them upside down if you want to, but I spread them out a little bit, and then I'm going to cover that with more of this sawdust or pet bedding. And that way I can separate one variety from another variety, and then if one decides to start rotting, hopefully they won't all rot. So here is another one. This one is called Purple Flame. Again, I am going to cut these stems down. I just find that they are a really good way to introduce damp, and we don't want that. And also they just take up more room if they've got a really long stem on them. So I don't want the stem. And then I'm just going to chop these bits off really quickly again. And this one's broken, so I'm just going to get rid of that because I don't want broken ones to go into storage. And that is as clean as I'm going to bother making that. So you can see it's still got a little bit of earth. The earth isn't completely dry. I mean, I could try and take some of that out, just to make sure there aren't any slugs and snails in there. But it's absolutely fine to leave a little bit. The more you get out, the less likely it is to rot. Certainly if you've got a wet environment or a damp environment like I do here in the UK. This one wasn't rinsed particularly well, so I'm just going to take some of that out. But in all honesty, the soil isn't too wet anymore. It's been sitting out for a week. It's quite dry, and I'm not too bothered about putting that into storage. So I'm going to again take this one without dividing it and pop it in with the tags, and then put this one into the crate like that, and then just cover it with a bit of this sawdust. This is Rocco, and in all honesty, Rocco is a pain. So whilst it's a wonderful dahlia, Rocco creates these incredibly dense clumps, and they are really heavy, and they're just absolutely jam-packed with tubers, and difficult to store and difficult to manage and difficult to pot on next year. So whilst I love Rocco as a flower, actually it's a bit of a pain, and I want to divide this before I put it into storage. So I'm literally just going to stab a knife down the centre and see what happens. There we are. So I'm just taking off the loose ones that I broke in that process. So this is still a really good and nice clump. It's still got absolutely loads of eyes around the centre here in the middle, and it's got some really nice tubers. So I'm just going to clean up the ends of this. I'm going to chop that one off because that's just too wobbly and broken. So we don't really want to put anything that's damaged into storage, because it will just introduce a possibility that it's going to rot in storage. So that's a much more manageable size for me next year when I come to pot them up. It's just a much smaller size. It'll fit into a pot better for when I'm just start, waking them up and growing them on. And then this again here, this is just really big and dense. You can see how dense it is here. So I'm just going to give this one another little split, try and find a nice spot to do it. You will lose a couple of tubers doing this, but it really doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter at all. So here, this sort of area, in fact I might leave these out to dry a little bit longer because they're quite wet still. So again, as long as you've got a nice area around the crown where you can see some eyes, that's all you need in order to grow tubers next year. To grow flowers next year. So I'm going to take Rocco and just place it on top. Now, because there's sawdust between this lot of tubers and the other lot of tubers, I don't have to worry about one of them maybe rotting and affecting the others. It's just going to keep it separate. So this is Daisy Duke, and again it's a very dense clump, and I'm just going to break it up and try to split it a bit because I want this one to dry out a bit more. So we didn't manage to rinse it properly. There's still a lot of soil. I really need this to dry out. So what I'm just going to do is tie this, because I've cut the stems off. Just going to fashion something to make sure that it stays labelled whilst it's drying out a bit more. Just get rid of some of that mud. Look, there's even a worm in there still, which we don't want. So I'm just going to leave these to dry out for another week, see if they get a bit drier. I'm actually going to cut this off. This is a damaged tuber I've just seen here, and I want to cut it now so that the end can callus over a bit before we put it into storage. And in doing that, I've now wrecked that bit. Okay. So all tubers really do come in different shapes and sizes. This is Rycroft Caroline's Beauty, and I mean there's barely even a tuber on there, but there are loads of roots. This one, I'm not even going to bother putting in a bag. I'm just going to pop it into the sawdust here. I don't think the label is going to come detached, and it's just one little tuber. It doesn't need to go in a bag. So you can just put them in. You don't need to have the bags if you don't want to. If you're interested in the bags, I will link them below in the description. This one is Café de Paris. Again, I'm just going to cut off the stem because it's just going to get in the way. And you really don't have to clean up these hairs if you don't want to. I'll show you. You can just plonk it in either your bag or straight into the sawdust, just like that. This is Café au lait rosé, and again I'm just going to take off this extraordinarily long stem and just trim off some of the dangly bits. Anything broken I don't want to keep, that's broken. Pop it in there. So everything now has a really nice layer of sawdust around it and on top of it, and I'm just going to fold over the paper and then carry this through to the garage, which is where we're going to store them through the winter. And then the only other thing to say is that it's quite important to check your dahlia tubers sort of once a month. Just have a root around and see whether they're all looking okay. If you notice any mould growing on any of them, then take those out and get rid of them because you don't want that mould to spread to anything else through the sawdust or anything like that. This should, if your dahlia tubers are dry enough, this should be the most perfect environment to store your dahlias through the winter, but nothing is a guarantee. So I can't guarantee that you won't get any mould. It does depend how much you've managed to dry them out before you store them, and other factors, obviously, you know, the temperature of where you're storing them. But I do find that this works, and I really hope that this video has been useful to show you how I do it and how I manage to have success each year overwintering my dahlias, even though I have to dig them out of the ground. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.